Subhrangshu, hi, it's good to have you with us today.
Hey Ashu, great to be with you. Always a pleasure being around with you. Yeah.
It's
Um,
these are very difficult times, and seeing you smile, hale and hearty, is a it brings a smile to my face.
no, I mean absolutely you hit the nail on the head because I think lesser said the better because I think these are absolutely crazy times and I think I just hope people are keeping safe, they're keeping
Right.
healthy, and just hoping and praying that we do kind of overcome this. But as they say, this too shall pass. So I think the whole idea is to be keep your chin high, be optimistic, and just keep hoping for the best and keep doing what you're doing.
Wonderful, wonderful. Before we dive into the topic today, and this is a conversation that I'm really looking forward to. I've always enjoyed my conversations with you, and I sincerely hope that everybody who listens to this conversation at Asia Tech Journal will continue to enjoy it as thoroughly. Subhranshu, it would be nice if you could run us through your professional experiences. You've had many of them. You've done some amazing work. You've built a lot of platforms ground up. It will be fantastic to know some of that bit before we dive into the topic.
No, sure. I mean, you know my background, and I think most people do know. But yeah, just to kind of sum it up, I think it's been a fascinating journey, and I think one feels truly blessed, having started out in the mid '90s. Pre the technology boom.
Right.
I think one has been fortunate to see multiple business cycles, right? Whether it was the first internet boom, whether it's the Lehman crisis, multiple things, and that every crisis, every situation, every business cycle actually has been a true learning experience. So started out, in the mid '90s with the Indian transnational Dabur. Cut my teeth in sales, distribution, marketing there for the first few years. Moved into retail with Reebok, was part of the core team in India and this part of the world.
Right.
Did some very cool stuff. Was very fortunate to be part of the core team there, which actually did some very wonderful stuff in a market like India and other emerging markets. Then moved into telecom, in the early 2000 when most of the people were jumping into telecom. So Richard Lee's India business, which was into internet and international long distance, I was fortunate to be part of that business. Post which we moved into media with Bennett Coleman, then did a stint in consulting with an Indo-Japanese venture based out of Tokyo and Delhi. And then I had a long stint, as you know, in financial services with the Religare Group as the chief marketing officer for the group. And that was really a fascinating journey because I was fortunate to kind of build every business or part of the core team that built every business grounds up. So right from equities to mutual fund to insurance, both insurance, life insurance, health insurance, asset management, wealth management, investment banking, not just in India but also other countries. So that was a very rewarding experience. Post Religare, I had, as you know, an experience in higher education with the Laureate India, business as the
Right.
chief commercial officer, and that again was a very different experience, but very enriching experience. So net, I think for about 20-25 years, I've been fortunate to see multiple business cycles, multiple categories. So FMCG, retail, telecom, education, media, financial services. And also, as you know, in my individual capacity, I've been reasonably active in the startup and the entrepreneurial
Right.
ecosystem, state venture ecosystem. So that again was something which I believe was my calling. So I always wanted to kind of do my own thing. So
Right.
19, when I transitioned from my day job, I actually jumped into entrepreneurship where I started out my own growth consulting platform, CBox Advisory.
Right.
So
Right.
we did some cool stuff for early stage ventures, for mid markets, and family managed businesses, as you know. And also, I've been fortunate to incubate a highly exciting fintech business wearing the co-founders hat called Escrow India. So
Right.
Escrow has built out India's first unique digital escrow platform. We've
Right.
actually created a category of sorts of digital escrows, the first in the country. And I am fortunate to be one of the early angels in that business, also sit on the board, and also now at an operating level don the co-founder's hat in that business.
Wonderful. Wonderful. That's some career, right? I think not a lot of people can really talk about the kind of expanse that you've had, right? And the kind of cycles that you've really seen, right? And I think after all of that, bringing that experience to making it available to startups, I think that just brings in so much more depth to startups that I'm sure you're working with, right? That understanding experience helps so much when it comes to decision making, right? And can really cut down the times of when one is planning to go to market, right?
See, I think Ashu, yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, if I can sort of give back based on my experience and based on my, sort of the width and depth of experience that I've had, fortunate to have had, if one can bring that to the table and really help founders, help the C-suite, and family managed businesses, I think that's the objective, right? And I think a lot of people know their product very well. They know their
Right.
business very well, but when it comes to business realities, I
Right.
think there are very practical challenges. So I think what we bring to the table is, or what somebody like me could potentially bring to the table is empathy, because you've
Right.
been in that, right? You've been in certain situations where
Right.
you've been in situations, and I think if people are going through not same but similar situations, you probably would be in a better position to help them, and help them kind of navigate.
Right.
I'm going to say so, in a slightly more effective and efficient manner.
Right. Uh, so Ranchu, you've been a professional who's been focused on growth, right? Irrespective of the role that you had, I think you've been somebody who's been strategically involved across all the functions of the business, right? Religare, more importantly, I think like I said, you built a lot of businesses bottom up. You've been a key decision maker in the process. Um, and also the fact that you've seen so many cycles, right? 2020 has been an unreal year, right? It's a year which has really changed processes, the way we consumed in last 100+ years, right? It's disrupted everything which is around us, right? I think a few things that have also happened good is that, it fast tracked for a ship like India, which is so large, it could just sort of, fast track the entire adoption of technology, right? Brought in a lot of transparency and, and irrespective of people where they came from, right? Not just say a metro or a tier 2 or a tier 3, have jumped onto this entire, bandwagon of technology adoption, buying, consuming content, so on and so forth, right? And the gap that existed, right, between the markets that we were, we are now sort of headed in that direction where we possibly will look like a homogeneous economy, right? Which was a complexity that was crazy for businesses to deal with, right? What are some of your thoughts, right? I mean, you're somebody who's, as mentioned earlier, right? You've seen a lot of cycles, right? 2020 has been an unreal year, right? How do you see this change, right? And what are some of the things that you think are here to stay, right? They will not possibly readjust to the new, once we open up and once we come back to the normal self.
See, I think, look, I mean, the sheer unpredictability and the enormity of this crisis uh, is how one would define it, right? It's
Right,
not economic crisis. So, unlike what we saw earlier in our earlier crisis, etc., they were more economic. This is
right,
health, this is social, this is economic in nature. So, I mean, it's an overabused word, but unprecedented is the word for it, right?
right,
Nobody. So as I said, unpredictability and the enormity of the crisis, the sheer number of people getting impacted, the countries getting impacted, absolutely through length and breadth. I mean, whether it is rich, poor, big, small companies, startups, large corporations, nobody's been insulated from what we've seen. So again,
right,
that's really clearly what has been the nature of this crisis. But having said that, every crisis brings to the table certain opportunities, right?
right,
And there is a silver lining everywhere. So I think one of the biggest thing, as you rightly said, has been this whole digital transformation that we've seen.
right,
Mini transformation of sorts that most businesses, some businesses are already digital, obviously have gone to the next level. Businesses which were traditionally, more physical in nature and more conventional in nature have adopted digital. So digital transformation by default or by design, has actually become a reality today.
right,
People realize that it's not a option, but it's a compulsion, right?
right.
And the other thing is digital payments. How people have started transacting as a mechanism. That is a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
The other is the way I see it, which is which has come to the fore, is how people are going to market or how people are innovating. Imagine, and I keep giving this and quoting this example from one of my previous employers, my first company actually, Dabur.
Right,
They've actually launched 8 or 10 products in a matter of weeks and months, which is
right,
unprecedented. Imagine a large company, a relatively, I won't say conventional company, but yeah, it's more in the conventional frame, an FMCG company launching multiple products within weeks, which otherwise would have taken them maybe months or probably a couple of years to launch. So I think
Right.
speed to market, route to market, and innovation, clearly is something which is an outcome or a green shoot of this entire crisis,
Right.
and I think it's here to stay. Plus, we've seen some new categories emerge and blossom. So, edtech, for instance, fintech, for instance,
Right.
fintech, for instance. I mean, these were businesses which were already there, but I think the way they've kind of now gone to the next level or catapulted to the next level is phenomenal, right? So clearly, yes, on one hand, as I said, you have the enormity and the unpredictability of the problem. You have the bloodbath, you have the craziness, you have the morbidity, and you have the sadness and the unfortunate, nature of the situation, or the unpredictable nature of the situation. And on the other hand, of course, you have opportunities. So I think any business, any enterprise, any commercial venture, or for that matter, any enterprise would really be better served. I mean, would be better served if they were to look at the positives and chug along by, sort of capitalizing on these opportunities that this situation has thrown open. Right. The other context that one needs to see is how consumer sentiment has changed. So, I
Sure.
mean, I was reading a report somewhere, 90% of consumers or 90% of potential audiences that people are talking to, fear is the single most factor, which is the overriding concern. So,
Right.
in a situation like this, how do you expect consumption to happen? It will definitely have a direct bearing on what they're consuming, how
Right.
they're consuming, how they're interacting with brands. So I think clearly that's another situation. The other situation or the dimension which we've seen is supply chains have broken down
Right.
completely. Right. I mean, traditional supply chains are broken down, distribution mechanisms are broken down. Of course, there are opportunities, but clearly that's something that companies need to look at.
Right.
And of course, trust deficit has increased, tremendously, right?
Right.
So given this changing situation, changing macros, changing consumer sentiment, I think the entire equilibrium or the situation, how brands and organizations, look at the market, look at consumers, look at opportunities to grow, I think they need to rethink, right?
Right.
Traditional ways of growth, traditional ways of looking at things, traditional route to market, traditional go to market strategies won't work. And the
Right.
sooner you realize that, and the sooner you're able to pivot, and the more sort of agile you are in terms of your thinking and execution, the better it is. You'll be better
I,
served.
I think I had my next question essentially was that how do you redefine growth in a modern day context, right? In a post 2020 context, right? And I think you've touched upon that, right? But more a little more deeply, right? How do you define growth going forward, right? Startups definitely are more agile, right? They were businesses that were built on a foundation of technology, right? They were anyway dealing with a lot of you know uh, I mean, they had technology right at the core of their delivery, right? At the core of their planning, at the core of understanding a customer, right? So startups are definitely in a better environment when as soon as this sort of we hit that patch of 2020. A lot of traditional businesses have not been prepared for that, right? So while I hear you when you say Dabur could launch a lot of products, they were possibly fortunate, right? Not a lot of other traditional businesses have had the know-how to handle a situation like this, right? How do you think growth will look like, or how do you define growth beyond 2020 for a lot of these brands that are, who don't really understand digital and technology in the true sense?
See, I think, Ashu, it's not just about growth in 2020 and beyond. It's about understanding growth, right? I mean,
Right,
growth could mean different things to different people, right? For some, it's about revenue enhancement. For some,
right,
it's capitalizing on a new business opportunity, getting into a new market segment, new geographies. For some, it's about capital raise, right? For a startup, especially younger companies who are always capital hungry.
right,
You outcome is always often growth, or a growth agenda are these things, three or four things: revenue enhancement, new opportunities, new business challenge, business opportunities, and maybe capital raise.
right,
I think what is important is that you need to have the right building blocks for growth. And at times, what happens is people tend to put the cart before the horse,
right,
right? Which is where I think possibly people tend to go a little wrong, and they
right,
need to introspect and see that, look, if this is the outcome that I want to achieve, what are my building blocks for growth? And I think it's very important to focus on the building blocks. I was telling somebody that as part of our core advisory proposition, what we tell people, especially emerging businesses, mid markets, and family managed businesses is, and actually for that matter, any organization, whether you're large, small, enterprise class, or startups,
Right.
fundamentally it's about three or four things.
Right.
First, as I'd like to call it, the four P's: positioning, processes, people, and pace. Right?
Right.
Only when these four P's, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about these
Sure,
four.
please.
When these four P's actually work in harmony or in unison, is when you actually achieve true growth.
Right.
So there
Right.
are organizations who may focus on a couple of these P's. There are a few organizations who maybe disproportionately focus on maybe one P, but not the others. But I think the submission or the advice is that start focusing on these four P's together. Now, what are these four P's? Positioning is number one.
Right.
Two is about processes. Three is about people, and the fourth is pace.
Right.
So when you say positioning, it's not just about positioning as we hear it in advertising or brand building, etc. It's about your narrative.
Right.
What is it that you stand for? How do you articulate it? I think
Right.
most people go wrong at this stage. They know their product well, they know their business well, but I think the entire narrative, which is a meaningful and
Right.
relevant from both a customer or a consumer standpoint, or
Right.
also from a fundraise standpoint, at times that's the first building block which people need to focus on. So
Mm-hmm.
building that narrative, sharpening that narrative, and also redefining that narrative, depending on
Right.
the situation, is what people need to focus on. That's one. The other are processes, both in terms of sales, marketing, go to market. What kind of processes have you put in place?
Right.
Maybe a 5 crore organization or a 500 crore organization. If your processes are not in place from day one, then obviously you're surely headed for disaster,
Right.
right? So irrespective of what stage and what age you are as an organization or as a company, those processes, focus on those processes is very important. At times
Right.
people feel that, look, I'm a raw startup, I'm in a very early stage venture. How are processes relevant for me?
Right.
Processes equal to bureaucracy, which I think is wrong, because I
Right.
think process is not equal to bureaucracy. Process is about having SOPs. It's about having templates. It's about having a structured way of approaching things
Right.
and looking at ways in a more structured fashion for all your functions, for all
Right.
your aspects of the business, and taking a 360-degree view on the business. The third is about people. You may be a 5-member organization or a 50 or a 500-member organization, but
Mm-hmm.
if at any given point in time your people or your core resources, at the end of the day, who's executing? Your people are
Right.
executing.
Correct.
They are not aligned with your vision, if they are not aligned with your strategy, if they are not aligned with your narrative, you
Right.
may have a brilliant strategy, you may have a brilliant narrative, but you know it falls flat on execution.
Right.
So I think alignment, people aligning your key stakeholders, whether they are insourced resources or your outsourced resources, let's say your
Right.
agency partners,
Sure.
executive partners, is very, very important.
Right.
One thing, which is a very, very key, sort of building block for growth and any business enhancement is pace. And simply put, it's execution.
Right.
You have the best of strategy, you may have the best thought process, you may have great people and the best talent working with you, but if you don't maintain an optimal operating rhythm for the
Mm-hmm.
business,
Right.
uh, you're not doing justice to the business, or you're not just doing justice to your agenda.
Right.
So as I said, to summarize, it's when these four building blocks, and there could be two others or three others
Right.
beyond these four. This is purely from my context and my experience, that if you were to contextualize the framework, these are the four sort of building blocks which become very, very critical, which when work in harmony and in
Right.
unison can
Right.
truly kind of propel you to the next level and prepare you for being growth ready
Right.
and taking it to the next level.
Very interesting. I think I kind of concur with pretty much all of what you said, right? And a lot of that is visible. When you see it at a distance, right? A lot of this is visible, right? And you kind of question yourself, why can't the management see it, right? Where is the gap? And given that we work with startups and a lot of other businesses, I think this is a question that comes to you more often than not, right? But I think, Subhrangshu, when I look at it, when I look at the canvas, right? One of the biggest challenges that I kind of see is a conflict, right? And that conflict is between, is it strategy first or execution, right? And I think more often than not, right, it's the mindset problem that one kind of you know has to sort of tackle, deal with, when you are in advisory capacity, and so on and so forth, right? What are your thoughts about that? I mean, how do you see that bit, right? How do you think that shift in mindset can be brought? How important is that? And of course, the conflict that one has to sort of tackle between strategizing it well and execution.
No, very important. Mindset, I believe, is the most important thing.
Right.
Uh, I mean, you may have great strategy, but ultimately, what is going to take you forward is the execution and the mindset, right?
Right.
And it's easy to change mindsets,
Right.
because people have fixed notions, they have fixed ideas, etc., and they believe that the thing can be done in a certain way. But I
Right.
think people who've sort of displayed resilience, who've
Mm-hmm.
displayed openness, and people who have had a growth mindset, I think are clear. I mean, there are n number of examples. We don't need to
Right.
take. I mean, you look at all successful startups. You look at organizations. You look at mid-sized players. Any organization which has done well, I think at the core of it is an open mindset. The
Right.
core growth mindset. So mindset is very, very critical,
Right.
right? And that becomes core to enabling growth. And more often than not, it's about outside in thinking. It's not
Right.
so good inside out thinking, right?
Right.
Most people believe in inside out thinking, that this is how I see this is the way things can be done, this is how I foresee the problem. But I
Right.
think outside in thinking, which is basically borrowing from expertise which is outside your own ecosystem,
Right.
is very important, and that can only happen when you have an open mindset.
Right.
you know uh, a lot of people want good talent, but when that talent, let's say hypothetically, comes on board and is working along with you with certain new ideas and new thought processes,
Right.
some of those ideas are not accepted and some of those ideas are debunked, right?
Right.
I think we've seen that most successful organizations are able to not just harness their own thinking, but
Mm-hmm.
also import some of these best practices and ideas from their external ecosystem and display a great sense of outside in thinking to deliver business growth. So
Right.
mindset is very, very critical, and I think people who have an open mindset, people who have so as they say, there is something called a growth mindset. Now, what
Right.
is every not every individual will have that growth mindset.
Right.
The answer is, can growth mindset be cultivated? My belief is yes, or my view is yes, definitely it can be cultivated.
Right.
You train your mind, you need to train yourself in a manner that you're thinking growth, you're thinking opportunities, you're
Mm-hmm.
thinking in an agile and an open manner, and you're
Right.
not just kind of always thinking either right or wrong. You're thinking objectively, you're thinking collaboratively, and you're
Right.
thinking comprehensively with the view that, look, I have certain ideas which may not be the best ideas. Let me also see what's happening outside the ecosystem. So people who
Sure.
have that porous mindset
Right.
to kind of let energies flow and let ideas flow both from
Right.
within and outside the organization or their own ecosystem, are eventually people who are successful. And there are a number of examples.
Sure. But I think when you say that, and I hear you, right? I think one of the biggest problem that becomes in the process is how do you prioritize, right? When you are, I mean, how do you sort of maintain that balance, right? Of what you're seeing outside, what you're kind of listening or what's happening. You're keeping a tab on your competition. You're actually keeping a tab on policy matters. What the government is doing. You're taking care of, or you're sort of you know kind of listening to what is happening internationally. What are some of the trends that are setting in and stuff, so on and so forth, right? How do you balance that, right? How do you prioritize? It becomes so much more challenging, right? And I'm purely sort of addressing this question from a founder standpoint, right, or a promoter standpoint. How do you really sort of prioritize in such a
It's
dynamic
very,
environment?
it's a very tough job. Prioritizing is very, very tough. And as somebody was saying, that if you're a founder or a CEO of a mid-sized company or any company for that matter,
Right.
now when I'm wearing the co-founder's hat and I've also kind of been in operating corporate roles earlier in my earlier avatar, I've
Mm-hmm.
seen that as a CEO of the organization, uh, there's immense pressure, and you're
Right.
always multitasking. And I
Right.
think multitask, effectively, are the ones who are able to kind of generate impact, right?
Right.
Because somebody was saying that CEO is essentially what chief everything officer. So right, especially in early stage businesses and young businesses, I think you as a CEO are responsible for everything. So it's not
Right.
easy. Easy said than done. Easier said than done. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I think prioritization is very important, and that's where you could do with some external help,
Right.
right? Sometimes what typically happens is, and see, that's also a cultural phenomenon. If you look at
Right.
cultures like US, if you look at cultures like America,
Right.
seeking help from others is fine. It's
Right.
absolutely fine. But in India, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my observation and what we've seen by and large is seeking help is not always necessarily seen as a good thing or a right thing.
Right.
What will people say? Oh, I don't know this, I'm expected to know this. No, you don't know everything, you can't know everything, right?
Right.
And that's where external expertise is available. Please go out and seek help, which is where mentorship, advisory
Right.
becomes much more critical and efficient, right?
You know, right.
So
No,
it's a part cultural thing, Ashu.
sure. I was in a similar conversation, right? And I think between me and my guest, right, and I think this is something that all of us have experienced, right, is that it's a very transactional relationship, that people are seeking in Indian market, right, which is, and that makes it very very shallow, right? It has to be looked at a more evolved relationship. It has to be looked at a trust relationship. I think that deficit of trust has to sort of a founder needs to be sort of open to trust people around him or her, and I think that'll help them absorb better. I think which is a key requirement. As we see it, right? Uh,
Absolutely.
so Raju, how important do you think, right? And I've seen this across my experiences, right? When a founder is building an enterprise, right? And like we said, like we discussed in our earlier question as well, right? It's difficult to sort of maintain that sense of balance, right? You're constantly in a sell zone, right? You're selling something to somebody, right? Internally, externally, other stakeholders, right? You're constantly in that zone, right? And I think that really sort of that sense of balance is skewed to believe that it's going to work, right? Which is also important, and I'm not disputing that, right? But when you're building growth, right, prioritization is important, right? How important is it for a founder to understand that, listen, there is somebody that I need to bring in who could be my custodian of growth, right? Who could have a balanced view towards things and not necessarily a very, skewed thought process, which is extremely bent towards a very positive outlook of everything is going to be right, right? Everything is going to work out, right? Balance is very, very important, like we discussed, right? How important is it to have a custodian of growth when you're building an enterprise? And that could be a co-founder, that could be an external resource, like you said, that could be somebody, slightly more mature, who could anchor the entire, the way you're building an organization.
No, I think it's very important, right? I mean, you could give whatever title to this custodian in an
Right,
organization, but I think there has to be somebody thinking growth for the
right,
organization,
right,
right? And you have to take a holistic sort of view around various functions. So it's not just about sales, it's not
right,
about development, not just marketing, it's not just people, but somebody who can take a more holistic view, somebody who can bring outside in thinking to the table, synthesize that with inside out thinking. But at
right,
the end of it, Ashu, my belief is that if somebody is the founder of his or her business, or somebody
right,
is an entrepreneur at the core, running a business, or somebody is at the helm of the affairs, ultimately that person is the chief custodian. So you can't
right,
really abdicate your role as being the chief custodian by simply getting in somebody to manage that role for you.
right,
You may get in the people, you may get in a bunch of people who could be either insourced or outsourced resources or your partners in growth. But
right.
ultimately, core custodian is the CEO or the founder or the entrepreneur himself, right?
Or the team around them,
Say that again.
or the core team around them.
Absolutely. So it's about building bench strength. It's about
Right,
building capability. So you may want to remain asset light by not really kind of building a very large team. You may
right,
kind of want to outsource a few critical thinking, critical functions. But at the end of the day, you can't outsource the thinking.
right,
Thinking has to be yours. The strategy has to be yours. You have to be the core custodian, but definitely have a bench strength in and
right,
around you which kind of creates a more, a strong bench or a strong capability, which enables or empowers you to deliver and
Right.
enables you to grow and scale to the next level.
Right. Subhrangshu, when you speak of growth, right, and typically when you're talking to promoter, founder, entrepreneur, and not just say in the startup ecosystem, but also in the traditional ecosystem, right? I think there is this mindset, right? Growth at any cost, right? Is one wants to grow, right? Without necessarily being able to, this is something that we've touched in our earlier questions as well, right? That lack of priority, right? How do you see that? Right? It's such a complex piece to handle, right? How do you see that? Is that a correct way of thinking? Uh,
That
you know,
growth leads to cost. I mean, if I have to
I
grow,
mean, grow at any cost, right? I mean that's an expensive choice to make, right?
no. So see, it's not growing at any cost. I mean, if the question or the thought is that, is it growth at any cost? I don't think that's the right way to look at it, because I
Sure.
think as a business, you're also responsible for various other outcomes, which are
Right.
social outcomes. You have to have a sense of purpose, and I think it's not just growth at any cost. So
Right.
if you're growing, but at the same time you're not kind of meeting your, sort of other agendas, be it social agendas or your, priorities as a business in
Hmm.
the ecosystem, uh, I think you're going wrong, right? It cannot be growth at any cost.
Right.
It has to be balanced growth, and it has to be growth which not only enhances you as a business, but also it has to contribute something in the
Right.
ecosystem, which brings to the question. I know it's again a very overused word these days, which is purpose.
Right.
What is your purpose as a business? The purpose is not transactional. A purpose is the, the larger vision that you have. So you may be
Right.
a fintech, but at the end of the day, your purpose is to create a safe and transparent ecosystem for other businesses to
Right.
operate.
Right.
That's your larger purpose, right? And you may be doing a bunch of things which enable, which it's basically enabling your business to grow in the ecosystem. So I think it is about purpose. It is about having a wider and a bigger vision, and it's
Hmm.
not about growth at any cost.
Right.
It's balanced growth. And I think the sooner people realize that it's about balanced growth, it's about sustainability, it's about the environment, the better it is. I mean,
Right.
look at fashion brands today. Look at apparel brands.
Right.
Everybody is today talking about sustainable growth.
Right.
Fashion, by the very nature, is
Hmm.
around, is kind of is stems out of consumption. It stems
Right.
out of abusing the environment. It stems out of dumping clothes, using throw
Right.
clothes, getting into more cycles. But today,
Right.
every brand, big, small, emerging brands, are all talking sustainable fashion, right?
Very.
And there are brands which are also openly saying, and they have the sort of guts to say that we are not a sustainable brand. I mean, I'm forgetting the name of this big brand, which has recently been quoted a couple of weeks back, saying openly on the social handle that I'm not a sustainable fashion brand,
Right.
because if I would think that I'm sustainable, then I would need to have processes, I would need to have an ecosystem which is 100% sustainable. So no
Right.
brand is 100% sustainable. So I think people are recognizing that growth is great, is good, but
Right.
growth at any cost is not good.
Right.
You need balance and see what's happening in our environment today. See what's happening in the world today. I mean, you may want to grow in an environment like this. You may want to kind of grow in these times, but are you doing enough for people around you? Are you doing for the ecosystem around you? Are you doing enough for the society? Is there a larger purpose for you as a business that you exist for? If not, you should seriously introspect, right?
Very
And
interesting.
stay true to that, while chasing your economic or commercial goals.
Very interesting. I like the fact, there are two things that you highlighted in this particular question that I had for you, which was one was purpose, and I think it's very, very important. I think the fact that the purpose now has to have a very clear thought process of building a responsible growth, I think is so much more important. So Raju, I'm gonna move towards a little bit towards you know uh, teams at large, right, within organizations, right. I think that's one of the most challenging pieces to tackle. That's one of the most complicated pieces to kind of tackle, especially when you're building it in India, right? And there's so much of diversity, right? It just becomes so much more difficult, right? The complexity is fairly large. Uh, how do you create a supercharged team, right? That's so important. Essentially, at the end of the day, it's about the people who are going to be with you while you're building that. I mean, you single-handedly cannot do anything. You need a team which is, which buys into your overall vision or the founding team's vision, and then is participating with equal will and power, right? How do you create a supercharged team, right? What are some of those points that one should kind of practice to build an environment which is healthy and which cultivates champions?
No, look, this is probably the most difficult part.
Right.
Getting the right people, cultivating the right team. It's probably the most difficult part, and that's where I think a lot of people need to spend a lot of time, because I mean, it's and this is where people at times go wrong. That
Right.
you pay more money, you get the best talent to work for you. So you're a funded venture, you have access to capital, and you get the best people to work for you. I think that's the wrong mindset, right? It's not necessarily always the case that you spend more and you get the best talent to work for
Right.
you. Right? It's about how do you create an environment, how do you create a culture where people feel empowered,
Mhm.
people feel there's a sense of ownership. So I think
Right.
it's also beyond just ESOPs. It's also
Right.
beyond just stockholding or shareholding that people are given in let's say organizations. It's about the culture that you create.
Right.
It's a kind of processes that you create. So
Mhm.
I think and that flows from the top, right? Whoever is the chief custodian of the business, whoever is the founder, or who are the core, let's say, people at the top. I think the way they think, that kind of rubs off in terms of creating the right culture for the
Right.
organization. So if you were to create a fabric within the organization which is a mix of monetary incentives, non-monetary incentives, cultural elements, and also sort of various other elements, that's when you create a culture which is more empowering and it's more liberating. Because I mean, ultimately, let's say I were to work in an organization, why would I be working there? I would
Right.
work in an organization not just for the money, but basically how it makes me feel every day and every hour when I'm in that organization or in the company of certain people.
Right.
So if how would you make somebody feel? I mean, it's like any social equilibrium, right? I mean, if you have a bunch of friends and if you have a social ecosystem, how do you make others feel around you? How do you make
Right.
your family feel around you? How do you make your friends feel around you? Right? It's the same thing about colleagues. It's the same thing about team members. So
Right.
if team members are happy being around you, if team members are comfortable,
Mhm.
secure, safe, and empowered being around you, I think that's when they deliver the best. So creating that sense of security, creating that sense of empowerment, creating that sense of ownership is very very critical, and it's easier said than done. People think, as I said, it's about throwing in cash and throwing in capital and you'll be able to do it. It's not that. It's about what you practice day in day out. It's about simple gestures. It's
Right.
about empathy, right? It's about actually stepping into the shoes of the other person
Right.
and thinking and feeling what that person is going through. I mean, look at the current times. I mean, there are organizations who've done a super job about asking no questions about earned leaves being taken by organizations,
Right.
unlimited stuff like that. We've been hearing things like that. So a lot of people, and why are people doing it? Because people understand that at the core of everything that anybody does in an organization, irrespective of the number of people that are there, it's
Right.
right. And I think that is ultra critical. Whether you're a family managed business or you're a startup or an early stage venture or
Right.
a large corporation, ultimately it's about people. You may have
Interesting.
best technology, best processes, but if you don't create the right culture and the right environment for your people, unfortunately, it's not going to work.
Right. Subhranshu, how important is it to reward risk in an organization? Right. And I think more so in an environment that we're going to be in post 2020. And given now that, essentially your consumer is now sort of, operating out of a few screens, right? There's a lot more transparency which is there, in terms of the behavior, the predictability, all of that, right? And what is also happening is the areas of influence have kind of significantly changed, right? And they become a lot more dynamic, right? So, for example, we're consuming a lot of content. Our preferences are shifting very, very fast, right? It's become a very, very dynamic environment, right? An organization cannot have, a one, uh, one product fits all play, right? They'll have to have a stack, right? They'll have to approach it more dynamically, right? The shelf life is going to be much smaller, right? And thus risk taking becomes important, right? On a lot of occasions, I mean, you cannot continue to take that, those decisions at a product level within the promoter founder's office, right? I mean, you'll have to empower people, like you also mentioned, right? How important is it to build a culture where risk taking is okay, right? Rewarding risk becomes a norm, right? How important do you think is that going to be going forward?
No, it's going to be very critical, and it is always critical that you have to encourage people to take free swings.
Right.
Right? But at the same time, it can't be a banana republic that you enable
Mhm.
people to, take free swings and there's no checks and balances. So I think all good organizations empower their people. All
Right.
good organizations don't look over their shoulders.
Right.
When people are performing, they give them that space and also encourage people to think differently.
Right.
They kind of breed innovation. But at the same time, it's very important to have checks and balances in place.
Right.
So depending on what stage of evolution you are as an organization, I think those checks and balances differ, right?
Hmm.
The larger you become, the more complicated these checks and balances, could potentially become.
Right.
But at the same time, you need to be very, very careful and steer clear of bureaucracy.
Right.
At times, what happens, and I've been, fortunate enough to see these transformations in some of the organizations that I've been. That over, let's say, a decade, in an organization that I was, I had actually gone through three cycles. There
Right.
was an early stage cycle in that organization where you were actually working like a startup. Then
Right.
there was, a slightly consolidation phase.
Right.
You reached a phase when you were actually getting into newer geographies, you were going global, and you're doing multiple other things, where suddenly the checks and balances, or the meaning of checks and balances, the definition of checks and balances changed.
Hmm.
But you were gravitating towards becoming a little bit more bureaucratic. So I think
Right.
what organizations need to say is that put checks and balances, but do not get bureaucratic about them.
Right.
Be nimble,
Hmm.
agile, and if something is not working for you, keep reviewing it and keep
Right.
and have the ability to recognize that if something is not working, please
Hmm.
change it and adopt something else. So I
Right.
think rewarding people for taking risks, innovating, thinking differently, definitely should be part of your cultural fabric. But at the same time, having checks and balances and processes is very important.
Right.
Otherwise, what typically happen is that it can actually be a reckless organization,
Hmm.
and you may potentially be derailed,
Right.
right? And it may also create multiple power centers in the organization. So I
Right.
think it's very important that to have right balance of empowerment with the checks and balances in place. And those checks and balances, as I said, can differ from organization to organization depending on what stage of evolution you are as an organization.
Very interesting. Something that you highlighted, right? In your point, right, kind of resonates, with me, and something that organizations, have to sort of grapple with, right, which is conflicts, right? When you're doing this, right, when you are in a high growth zone, when you empower people, right, they're bound to run into each other. They're bound to sort of, they're bound to be conflicts, right? And this is a topic which is not really talked about a lot. It's typically brushed on the carpet, right? Right. People don't want to address it, and uh, you know, how important do you think is to have a clarity in terms of how do you manage a conflict in an organization, right? And how can you possibly play it constructively, right? What are some of your thoughts on that?
I think two, three things, Ashu, and I think you're absolutely right that conflicts more often than not are brushed under the carpet. I think the
Right.
best way to handle conflict is to bring it out in the open, and conflict is not always bad.
Right.
People want to steer clear of conflict. They want to
Right.
stay away from taking harsh calls. They want to stay away from strong calls.
Right.
And taking tough decisions. So, but I
Right.
think that is not the right approach. You need to bring conflict out in the open. If there's a conflict, please resolve it head on. So I think two, three things. One, I think you need to have a culture of transparency and openness. So if
Right.
there is a culture which is transparent, which is open, which recognizes there is conflict and is willing to take on that conflict head on and
Right.
resolve it, I think that those are organizations which will naturally tend to handle conflict situations better than some other organizations.
Right.
Other is you should always have a rule book in place.
Mm-hmm.
right? Which means you need to have processes, you need to have rules, you need to have engagement models and frameworks in place which enable you to resolve conflict,
Right.
right? It can't be a free for all sort of a mudslinging, wrestling match, when it comes to conflict. So you need to have rule books, you need to have processes, you need to have systems which enable you to resolve this conflict. But more importantly, it's about transparency and
Right.
openness.
Right.
At times, what happens is that there is a simmering conflict that is there, but organizations are not transparent and open about it. And as a result of which, it snowballs into something far greater than it potentially is.
Right.
So if you're able to nip it in the bud by creating a culture of openness and transparency and taking it head on, I think that's where you would tend to do a better job than not.
Right. Right. So Raju, my this particular question that I'm asking you is more focused towards traditional businesses that are operating out of tier two, tier three cities, right? That have been built, with essentially the promoter's vision and so on and so forth, right? This is going to be a very, very difficult, environment for them to operate in, right? This is not something that they sort of were prepared for, right? I think this requires a completely new set of uh, understanding, right? The dynamics are very, very different. The consumer is very different. The priorities are changing fast, right? Uh, what do you think? There are some of those things that they can sort of do to manage, sustainability, right? In their current, operations, right? How do you bring in that new sort of a perspective and sort of engineer growth for markets beyond 2020.
Sure, but are you referring, is your question and referring to more conventional sort of
More
organizations?
conventional organizations, yes, because a lot of what you've said essentially is correct for a lot of high growth organizations, right? Conventional organizations, beyond a certain point, they come to a point where they're like, we're happy, we are operating at a certain scale and stuff like that. The aspirations are very different. I mean, the aspiration of growth remains to be there, but it's just that they're not prepared, right? And 2020 is become a year which is far more complex, right, from what it was. Your buyers are going to change shape, your distributors are going to have very different expectations, your customer is going to have very, very different expectations, right? So it's a very integrated ecosystem that now we've entered, right? Unlike what a lot of these brands experience, right? What are some of those things you think that they should do to be relevant beyond
No,
this particular
I think it's a very valid point, and I think a lot of conventional, so-called conventional organizations who've, sort of grown and thrived on physical distribution, physical infrastructure, etc., are realizing that in the new scheme of things,
right,
we need to go direct to consumer. So we've seen the emergence of the D2C model
right,
in far more stronger manner than it was in the past. So I
right,
think D2C, emergence of D2C, direct to consumer, is clearly one trend and one trend which is here to stay,
right,
right? So therefore, I think some of these conventional businesses need to leverage technology, need to leverage digital, and see how they can actually grow to the next level.
right,
The other is looking at new skill sets, looking at new people capabilities, whether these are in-source capabilities or outsource capabilities. That's a secondary story. But I think a different way of thinking and problem solving is required. A lot of examples come to the fore where conventionally people have been in physical distribution, but now with supply chains, as you said, breaking down, distribution ecosystems breaking down, collapsing, not being as efficient as they probably were, in situations like lockdowns, etc. How is it that these businesses can redefine themselves? The only way to do that is by leveraging technology, by embracing digital, looking at digital innovation, looking at newer things. And as I said, D2C, direct to consumer, clearly is a trend and clearly is a model that is emerging for
right.
most conventional businesses.
Very interesting. Subhanshu, with that, my last question to you, um, what do you think are the three or four most critical things that every organization should sort of, you know, uh, have or do, while they're preparing for a sharp growth in the coming years?
See, I think there are lots of things, but I think given the current context and the way this, the macros are shaping out, I think there are three or four things, which people need to focus on. I think first of all, as I said, leverage technology. As I call it, it's about technology. It's about digital innovation. So
Right.
keep leveraging technology. That's very, very critical. Second is about collaboration.
Right.
You as an organization cannot do everything yourself, so see how you could collaborate with people in the ecosystem. It could be brands within your same category or brands in other categories, because we've seen some fantastic collaborations happening over the last 1 year, where an FMCG brand has collaborated with a food delivery app, right?
Right.
Or let's say a pizza delivery company has collaborated with a FMCG major to redefine distribution and access to consumers. So collaboration is the way forward, right? And I think that is the way things are going to be going forward. And the third really is about mindset, right? It's about completely creating a mindset which is growth oriented, creating a mindset which is about outside in thinking, which is bringing fresh thinking on the table and looking at things differently. But
Right.
if you were to really create a framework, if I were to sort of put a framework to this, I would like to define it as the three E's.
Mhm.
So it's about energizing, it's about enhancement, and it's about excitement, right?
Right.
So one is about creating an environment or a culture where you're
Mhm.
not energizing yourself but also your team, and
Right.
encouraging them to think differently,
Mhm.
pivoting differently, and looking at new things.
Mhm.
The second, is about enhancement, which means revisiting your product,
Mhm.
revisiting your offering, right? And looking at newer ways of repurposing your product in the current context. So, which means if your product was what it was, maybe in the current context and in the future, it needs to take on a different avatar,
Right.
right? Third is about, as I said, is
Right.
engagement. Use this opportunity to actually grow by focusing on your existing clients, existing customers. Talk to them, understand what they want, and try and kind of leverage them much better than
Right.
to go out there and acquiring new customers. So these are essentially three or four things, but most importantly, it's about frugal growth.
Right.
It's about being capital efficient. It's about
Right.
being asset light, because at times, as you briefly alluded to earlier, people tend to correlate growth with high capital investments. Need
Mhm.
not necessarily be the case.
Right.
And in the current situation, I think you'd be better served, whether depending on whatever stage of evolution you are as an organization or as a business,
Right.
you are actually thinking of newer and more exciting ways to grow or innovative ways to grow by conserving cash, conserving capital, being
Right.
asset, and being frugal in your approach.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So, Raju, it's, as always, it's a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I think a lot of what you highlighted, makes, is so much more relevant, and makes so much more sense, with a definitive clarity, right? That founders and entrepreneurs and promoters need to look at, right? In the current times. I think these markets are going to be very, very different. These are going to be markets that are going to be very challenging. And these are going to be markets, more importantly, they're going to be very, very transparent. And like you said in your last point, right? Feedback is very, very important. Having your stakeholders who come in and work with you and build with you, and having a motivated set of team, which has a sense of purpose, having those champions to be part of your growth process. I think these are some very, very important, aspects that will really define how far a business goes, right? It was a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time out.
No, no, my pleasure. Always a pleasure interacting with you, Ashu, and thanks for having me over. And just hope everybody, stays safe, stays healthy, and I'm sure we'll get over this phase. And as they say, this too shall pass. So, wishing you, the team at Asia Tech Journal, all the best, and thanks again for having me
Thank you so much.
on.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, Ashu.